were all holding your breaths. All right, we have a little bit of food in us. Feel free to grab some food if you still need some more. There's some food out there. Grab some food, bring it in for the next session. So our next sessions will have screening presentations. So we'll be working through a panel discussion and some presentations. And then we'll jump over to lunch after that. So to kick off our screening presentations, I'll get Agnes to introduce our speaker.
Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, it's afternoon. And welcome back. Thank you so much for this morning and all the presenters and sessions. So we power through. Our next presenter is Monica Ferrie. Monica is the Chief Executive Officer for the Native Support Network of Victoria. She's one of my mentors and have been, knocking on her door, emailing her just to get a bit of advice on how we should run our organization. So our theme being the newborn screening, she's gone through this process and she understands this more than I do. And from the government point of view and just the process and how we can ask questions. And like for me, I've got questions about the 6-step process, which takes forever to be implemented. So I want us to understand and just keep that at the back of my mind and ask questions. Once we do, we've got a meeting in a few weeks with the Department of Health. We'll take those questions and see how they can improve the process. So without further ado, I introduce Monica Ferrie to present on screening in Australia. Thank you.
And again, amongst the ASCA community, I want to just begin by acknowledging that I'm coming to you from Wurundjeri land and that there is a deep connection to the land and culture from our First Nations people, and the land that I'm on, as all Australian land, has never been ceded. I also wanted to recognise at the beginning of my presentation that there is a collective commitment here to hard work, that our job doesn't end until we make the difference that we are seeking to make, and we're all here on the same team to do that. I also wanted to acknowledge the UN Global Resolution, because I think this is just a standard. It is a non-disputable requirement that we are seeking for all people living with rare conditions, and that is the equitable right, without distinction of any kind, to have access to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health, and to a standard of living adequate for health and well-being for oneself and one's family. And the cornerstone of that is knowledge, and screening is what can provide us with knowledge. I said before that we're all working together and we need to all work together. We need to be part of the same operating system because it is a complex system, newborn screening in this country. There are many players and many parts of that system, and there are many inputs into the decision making. So our engagement with the system and as part of the system, there are many things that need to be changed about the system, and I'll touch on that, but we all are part of making that system work. So just a common beginning of where we are in Australia with newborn screening. So Australia has had a newborn screening blood spot screening program that's for many years, for more than 50 years, that is consented to by more than 98% of newborn parents. So it is a highly successful population screening program. Each state includes about 26 or 27 conditions. So this is the real problem. We have access to newborns, we have high take up, but we're only testing for 26 or 27 conditions. So I'll talk more about that. So the MBS process to access for a recommendation includes a health technology includes a health technology assessment process, and it's federal. So our process for including conditions onto our newborn screening panels, blood spot, and I keep making that distinction because we are fast looking at what are the implications of genomic newborn screening, and that's different and going to be different from the blood spot screening process. We are, as the last point on my slide says, we are watching the UK because it is doing a major project at the moment exploring genomic research, genomic newborn screening inside a public hospital system like the NHS. So we're watching, and we will learn from many things that the UK will find out. But currently our process has an assessment stage and a recommendation stage, and then an implementation stage, 2 of which are federal, 1 of which is state. Our health system in Australia is a federated system. Each state makes its own decisions on funding and implementation based on a federal recommendation, but I will talk in much more detail about that in a moment. The responsibilities that the state governments and the federal governments have are enshrined in legislation. So we have federal legislation, and each state has its own legislation. There is an agreement between our state governments and our federal government about how money will be spent, but not where it will be spent. Complex and onerous. The process for newborn screening assessment is currently under review, and it's unclear where it will land. I'll talk about where the process is currently at, but in 6 months' time, it may not be exactly the process that we are following. So again, a complexity that we don't need in this space. I also wanted to share some research that was done in 2020 or 2021 about just what people in Australia think about newborn screening, because this is critically important for advocacy. So these are just the key findings and some high level data, but what it does tell us is that newborn screening is something that in Australia is very much supported by parents and grandparents. So it is well looked upon. People understand, the public understands that having access to knowledge is highly valuable because we want healthy families and healthy children. So we have research that supports that. We also have research that says that there is little or not enough understanding about the current system. So what is screened for, what isn't screened for, how those conditions are determined, where the money comes from. There is a lack of information about that, and it's quite difficult to find that out as well. So if you were interested, it's not so easy to find out what's being tested for in each state. Because of that lack of ease of access to information, it's then more difficult to actually talk to health professionals about what your expectations might be. So we know we have those limitations. And we also know that the public thinks there's room to improve. And of course, absolutely there is. So the key findings that came out of this particular study, which was an Australian study of Australian families, is that parents and grandparents are strongly supportive of newborn screening. We know there's unmet need. We know that we need to raise public awareness. We know that there is an expectation that governments will play their role, and absolutely we need governments to play their role. Advocacy is a key platform required to change anything in this space, and there is an opportunity to leverage grandparents, not just parents, in an advocacy strategy. So I'm now going to concentrate on what the process is. So I mentioned that we have assessment, which leads to a recommendation, and then we have implementation. So stage one, and I'm going to talk about the assessment process first. So we're talking federally. So assessment is a federal responsibility. So it's a responsibility of the Australian government. On the Department of Health Australian Government website, there is an application form, and that form is about 9 pages already before anybody fills anything in. So it's quite a complex form asking for lots and lots of information that, unless the information is there, there is absolutely no chance that an application will find its way through the system. And that's one of the barriers, because the questions that are asked and the way that those questions are asked are not particularly accessible either. So, and sometimes that information that's required isn't yet available. So that becomes a real barrier in newborn screening in particular, because usually the sponsor for a newborn screening application, for something to be added to newborn screening panels, is coming from a patient advocacy group. It's not coming from a pharmaceutical organisation, or it's not coming from a health professional. Traditionally, the leading of ensuring that something is recommended for addition is coming from patient groups. You need those partnerships, but the driver in the newborn screening space is generally a patient advocacy group. The application then is the first point of assessment. So the application is submitted, and an assessment is made by people inside the Department of Health, a expert team inside the Department of Health, and also a program management committee. The program management committee is a group of health experts across the country. So they are diverse, they're representative across the country, and they come together to look at an application, and together with the team from Department of Health, they conduct an initial assessment. So they would do a literature review. The Department of Health would do that. They would look at what evidence has been provided. They look at how that evidence has been evaluated over time. They look at, is there a treatment available for the test that is being sought to be added? And they look at, do we have a population of that particular condition group in Australia? What's the relevance to the Australian population of the particular application? And then they make a recommendation to the Chief Medical Officer. So already we've got so many different players involved, coming from so many different backgrounds, and this process can take 6 months, it can take 18 months. It depends on how comprehensive the information is that finds its way into that initial application. If at any time the application is deemed as needing more, it just goes straight back to the patient advocacy group with information that says, we need some more about X, Y, and Z. So lots of feedback in the process, but it is a onerous, complex, comprehensive process already. So, and that adds to the length of time that the whole process takes. So at this point, the fact that something's been submitted, that it's being assessed by the program committee and by Department of Health, at this point, states are all advised that there is a test that is going through the process. And that's really important because it's the states who are the ones who are responsible for implementation. In the past, there hasn't been a direct link to advising states that an application has been submitted. That's been up to patient support groups to say, oh, gee, we need to tell the states about it. It's now formally part of the process so that they are advised and can start thinking already about where the money is going to come from to add that test to a newborn screening panel, or add that condition to a newborn screening panel. And I'll talk a little bit about the complexities of that in a few moments. And I've mentioned that if at any stage the application is not recommended, it goes back to the sponsor for reworking or additional information. So the Chief Medical Officer recommends that the application goes through to stage 2. At stage 2, that means a full health technology assessment. So, and a health technology assessment is something that I'm sure many people here are aware of, because it is an assessment process that's used globally for a whole variety of different mechanisms use it to include health technologies on subsidized medication listings, on universal health coverage access. So it's a very globally agreed system for how we make assessments. Whether it's the correct one for newborn screening, it is new to our newborn screening process. So it was introduced about 6 months ago, maybe a little longer now, 8 months ago. So it is a new piece of the puzzle. Therefore, it is a new set of hoops that are required to jump through, because it is seeking a depth of economic information, a depth of real-world evidence that wasn't there previously for our newborn screening process. And the people that are conducting that health technology assessment is our Medical Services Advisory Committee. Most of the work that the MSAC, that the Medical Services Advisory Committee do, is about reviewing testing and technology that will become part of the Medicare benefits scheme. So they are looking at HTA assessments regularly, but have only just begun to look at newborn screening as part of their responsibilities. So they are making a recommendation on the basis of that application that comes through to them. They're assessing based on the HTA assessment itself, safety, effectiveness, cost effectiveness assessments, the real world evidence, and then they make a recommendation that gets progressed to the Federal Health Minister and the Chief Medical Officer. This is the first time the Federal Health Minister has seen it, unless he has had people advocating to him to say, you need to be aware that this is happening and it's coming through a process, so watch out for it. The Chief Medical Officer and Federal Health Minister will discuss the implications and then make a recommendation for inclusion. Their recommendation is simply that it is just for inclusion to newborn screening blood spot panels in each state. They make that recommendation to the State Health Chiefs Executive Forum, and they post decisions on the Department of Health. And at that point, the federal responsibility is released. And now the assessment is obviously critically important, but the implementation is really where the rubber hits the road, because the recommendation without implementation is meaningless. So states, and hopefully they've been doing this since they are made aware that something is going through, that a condition is going through the process. So they review their budget position and possibilities, because it is the states that need to fund the recommendation. At the moment, there is no additional funding made available to states to say, we recommend that you include this condition onto your newborn screening panel, and here is $1 million to support the implementation of that addition. Currently, that isn't how it works. So each state makes its own recommendation about whether it will include it or not, based on its position. And some of the things that they consider is, and timing's important as well, because our states, as our federal government, as in every country, has a budget cycle. So timing's important because the release of money has to be part of that budget cycle. So things that they are considering is the technology available? So we've seen recently with SMA that SMA has been recommended. It is being added around the country, but one of the initial barriers for adding SMA was that states didn't have the technology required to simply add it to a newborn blood spot screening panel, because it requires a different step, a new step in the process. So part of then that decision becomes, and do we have the capacity in our laboratories, in our workforce? If we start testing for this, we want to be able to support families. Well, can we support them? Do we have things in place to support them? Are there efficiencies to be gained by managing timing? Again, we've seen this with SMA and SCID. So two conditions that actually require a very similar type of technology in the testing. So a lot of states made decisions to say, well, we're not going to add SMA until we can add SCID. So let's do them both at the same time. What's the pressure from the public in the state? So advocacy is critically important, as always. Media is important. Lived experience is important. The absolute clarity around what are the risks and consequences of not implementing, they're all in the application, but they need to, each state is making its own decision now, so each state needs to understand what the consequences and risks are. And as I mentioned, the recommendations are not incentivised by the federal government. So we know that this system is under review. We know that it takes far too long. Our federal government knows that it takes too long and wants it wants more positive outcomes through the newborn screening process. It wants to assist the states. So before our our federal election earlier in the year, there was money released for the newborn screening programs. How that will impact the current process is something that we don't know just yet. So thank you. That's a whole load of information there, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Monica, for that comprehensive presentation. A bit confusing for me, but I'll come back to the office and get the notes. So we've got questions. Before we get questions in the room, we've got a question or a statement in the chat box. You can read that, Monica, and respond whilst we get the question in the room, please. The microphone so there's a question in the chat box. Did you see that, Monica?
Sorry, Agnes, I can't see.
So there's a statement or a question in the chat box. Could you see
that? From Felicity?
Yeah.
Okay, so the $38 million, Felicity's question is about the $38 million announcement by the Australian government before the election. So that $38 million was a commitment to, and is a commitment to, reform the processes. The expansion, the new health minister has talked about expanding the newborn screening panels to around 80 conditions. We don't know what the process is going to be to introduce those 80 conditions. We don't know what those 80 conditions are going to be. There are 80 conditions on panels in the US, but they're not 80 separate disease conditions. They are along a disease continuum for some of them. So there's lots of complexity here about changes that will be made in, and we hope in a really short period, as short a time as possible. This has been a problem for years. We need it addressed. We know the federal government the Australian federal government has committed to ensuring that those changes are in place. How long that is going to take, and whether we can actually find our way to 80 conditions on our newborn screening blood spot panel, especially with the genomic newborn screening possibilities coming. I think that's as much as I hate to say this, I think that's a wait and see, because genomics opens up the possibility to many more, because it's not a blood spot. We don't know what that process is going to be, but it opens up the possibility of testing on a much broader level. So is 80 conditions enough? No. Can we test more broadly, potentially with genomics, with the entry of genomics newborn screening? But we're going to have to wait for the results from the UK for that.
Thank you for that, Monica. We've got one more question, then I've got a slightly tiny question, then we go to the next session. So you had a hand up.
Monica, I had a quick question regarding the process when it comes to the assessments based on numbers. Does it include targeted groups, like from different demographics or ethnic backgrounds? Or is it just based on general population head counts?
Does what exactly, sorry, I was having a little trouble hearing you, but
what I'm saying is, does the assessment process take into account people that are, for example, from the Middle Eastern background or from the African background, as their ratio numbers are higher with the sickle cell percentages of newborns, as opposed to people from different areas. So when you go to certain countries, they've got a very high rate, so they implement those mandatory screenings in their countries. But I don't see that being reflected in Australia. Obviously, because of the population, how is that assessment process taking place? Is it generally based on the general numbers in population, or is it based on, do you take into account the demographics with that percent? Because if you're not looking at demographics, it's nothing. It's literally off the radar.
So the process takes into account whatever information is fed into the process. So, and the demographic piece is a critical piece for many conditions. But when we're talking sickle cell, it cannot be ignored. So the population numbers will be considered, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a cost-effective reason, or it's not even cost-effective. That's just one piece of the puzzle. That doesn't mean that there is a million other good reasons why sickle cell shouldn't be on the newborn screening panel. Traditionally, we've seen early intervention being something that, if early intervention makes a difference, then there is a greater likelihood, which makes some logical sense with newborn screening, that it would be a consideration. So there is the information on the application that is submitted will trigger searches within literature in other countries. It's not a literature review of what's going on in Australia. It's a literature review of what impact screening or intervention has around the world. So it is, how do we build the best knowledge bank so that we can make the most informed decision, and that has to take into account the demographics, in a multicultural society like ours as well, just critically important that those things are part of the consideration.
Thank you.
I hope I've answered that.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Monica. We've got questions in the chat box. Could you please just respond because of time? And just one more little thing I wanted to, just a contribution maybe, as you said before, there's so many players, as I've discussed this with you, like our organization is really young, so you get communication from this organization, from that organization, and I've spoken to some of these organizations, like, could we just, come together, same table, discuss the same issues, and that's maybe something that, like your leading organization you could do in the future, so that we are all on the same page. But thank you for the very comprehensive presentation, and the questions in the chat box, because of time, please could you respond, and we'll get a screenshot, or get a printout we'll share after the conference. But thank you so much for your time.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.
All right, to introduce our next speaker and the moderator of the panel discussion, Dr. Monica.
Insight into a very complex process, I suspect. My name is Monica, as everyone's just heard. I'm a paediatric hematologist and oncologist from Women's and Children's in Adelaide. And I'll obviously be moderating the next section. I hope everyone's caffeine levels are up. And Mwewa, thank you for the heads up on the questions you will be asking me on the way home. I'm also topping up on knowledge. So without much further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Giselle Kidson-Gerber, who is presenting on prenatal and antenatal screening in sickle cell disease. Dr. Kidson-Gerber is a clinical and laboratory hematologist at the largest thalassemia and sickle cell disease centre here in Sydney.
Thank you, it's great to be here today. So as Monica said, I'm a clinical haematologist, and my two interests there are management of patients with major hemoglobinopathies, either sickle cell disease or beta thalassemia. And my other clinical main interest is obstetric haematology, and so I run a clinic at the Women's Hospital, and so I look after patients with sickle cell disease. I look after women in pregnancy who have sickle screening tests and don't know how to interpret it. We're going to talk about the genetics there. And my other hat is that I work in a laboratory, and I'm in charge of the hemoglobinopathy screening, and I link them with molecular. So there's sort of all the things that I do all the time I'll be covering in my talk today. Just checking if it's up. It's the one which says antenatal screening. As we start, it's very interesting when Hannah shared her experience with us today, and she said, my mother was lucky to have been tested in pregnancy and found out she had sickle cell. We have processes in place. We don't want it depending on luck. We really need processes in place, which we do have. So I'm going to be running through those processes. That's the sort of the gist of my talk. So I'll be covering the genetics of sickle cell disease, talk about the different screening methods, the tests that we can do, the timing, the options following the results, and then community approach. So, as you know, hemoglobinopathies are very common, and there are genetic changes that lead to abnormal red cells, which then, or abnormal red cell production, which then leads to the sickle cell disease, sickle cell anemia. As we heard earlier, it can be combined with thalassemia. And just very briefly, there's the beta globin chain problems, which include sickle cell and beta thalassemia and some other variants. There's also the alpha thalassemia, which is on a completely different gene, on a different chromosome, which we heard about in one of the earlier talks. And these are autosomal recessive conditions. I'll come back to what that means. So the sickle gene is on chromosome 11, and it's one specific change in the DNA, which then leads to a change in the amino acid sequence, which then changes the actual beta globin that's produced, and that then changes the structure of the beta globin and then changes the functionality of the cell. So it's very much a stepwise, one change leads to the next and the next and the next, and that's why we can do screening and testing, because we know what these changes are. And we've talked about the distribution around the world, which you're familiar with, and I think this is obviously an increasing situation in Australia with the changing in migration that everyone needs to be aware of, and education is really important. If we then think about screening, why do we want to screen? Well, some of it's been raised today. Early detection of affected offspring, particularly in sickle cell disease, leads to improved outcomes, and we know that, and that's fantastic. But we also know that if we can detect at-risk couples, they have increased reproductive choices. And we talked about informed decision making. We want everyone, whether they're a child or an adult, a male or a female, to be able to make the best choices. And so they need to have good education and understanding of their own medical situation to be able to do that. So there are different times when you can screen. We can have premarital screening, so that is mandatory, so compulsory in some countries such as Cyprus, Saudi Arabia, the Palestine territories, and so that's a different situation. We don't do that in Australia. And so the next step would be preconceptions. That is before the woman is actually pregnant, and that is the ideal time to screen, and that's what we can do in Australia at the moment without the newborn screening situation. Antenatal or prenatal, those two terms are interchangeable in this particular conversation, and that's when the mother is pregnant and we then screen her, and so that's another time point. And the newborn screening is when the baby's born and using the blood from the baby, and that isn't available at the moment in Australia, and we heard that talk just before. And it's interesting, in Australia there are different practices in different parts of the world, of the country, and it depends on your local health district. So in Sydney, in some parts of Sydney, there's compulsory testing in every woman who's pregnant, because in those particular health districts there's the largest population of people from the multi-ethnic population that we know that sickle cell and thalassemia falls into. In other parts of Sydney and Australia, it's a selective process, which I'll talk about in a minute. And once again, that the earlier that a couple is aware of their risk, the greater the options they have for pregnancy. So the preconception and antenatal, that's what I'm going to be talking about now in the rest of the talk. So just a reminder, so autosomal recessive inheritance is when the mother and the father are both carriers, And so everyone has 2 copies of the gene, and both of them have 1 copy of the sickle gene, for example, which leads to a 1 in 4 chance of them having an affected offspring, 50% chance that their children will be carriers, and then a 1 in 4 chance of an unaffected offspring. So if I change this to sickle cell disease, it's saying that the mother and father both have sickle cell trait that we've heard about, and then there's a 1 in 4 chance of having a child with sickle cell disease, and you can see on that infographic. So sickle cell trait usually has no symptoms. We heard a little bit about what potentially could happen, but most people will be unaware. And so if you look at the different things, we say, does someone have so in medicine, we have a patient or a person who comes to you. If you ask them about their symptoms, you probably wouldn't get anything in someone who has sickle cell trait. Then if you do a simple blood test, such as the full blood count, you can have a look at the hemoglobin and the MCV, which we do every day, and they can also be normal in patients who've got sickle cell trait. But if we do specific hemoglobinopathy screening tests, which are very simple and can be done in the laboratory very easily, we'll then pick up the sickle cell trait. And this is the key message, I think, from my talk, is that patients, so we're not even patients, just men and women who are silent carriers, they're silent because they don't know they have sickle cell trait, can be detected with a specific blood test. You just need to order the blood test, and it's a really simple thing to do. So just as running through the blood tests in more detail, we do a full blood count, and that's what we do very routinely in lots of patients. But that won't necessarily show us the sickle cell trait. We look at the iron studies, that helps us interpret the tests, and then the hemoglobinopathy screen depends a little bit from laboratory to laboratory, but every laboratory uses 2 different methods. So earlier in one of the talks, you could see there was a picture with all these sort of different stripes up and down. That's an older test that some laboratories do, but most laboratories have more technical, advanced tests with high throughput, with more modern machinery. And so laboratories have great systems in place for this type of testing. There are extra tests that we might do, like a sickle cell test. Sometimes do molecular testing, which is actually looking at the genes that a particular person has. And then mass spectrometry is a potential option, particularly in sickle cell, but not so good for thalassemia. So if we order a sickle cell or a thalassemia or a hemoglobinopathy screening test, which is sort of common, you could use any of those expressions, those top tests are the tests that should be ordered. So the next slide, this is about, as I said, some health districts, every pregnant woman, or ideally before pregnancy, would be tested. That's called universal screening, so every woman is then screened. And this is compared to selective screening when you choose who is selected. And so the advantage of the universal screening is you don't think twice. A woman comes in and she wants to fall pregnant, or she's pregnant, you just test her. Whereas in selective screening, you've got to work out whether you should test the woman who's sitting in front of you. And so the selective screening is much cheaper and has less demand in the laboratory because you're not testing every single woman, but there's potentially the issue to miss patients who might be a carrier of something like sickle cell. Either way, as the doctor or the midwife gives the patient the blood form to go have the blood test, the woman still needs to go and have the blood test, and so screening definitely depends on the woman and the husband understanding about the test needing to be done and actually getting it done. If the results are not normal, so we usually it's the woman, and then if she has an abnormality, we then go and screen the father of the child or the potential father, and so the second set of tests also need to be followed up, and that needs to be performed. And as I said here, both universal and selective screening are more useful the earlier they are performed in pregnancy or even pre-pregnancy. So we looked at a lot of data in our laboratory. We set up an algorithm back in 2018, and our local antenatal service, hospitals and all the midwives and the GPs in our district, sort of a fairly large district, use this algorithm. And I'm just going to run through this because this is really the basis of screening for sickle cell disease as we have it at the moment. So firstly, we need to request a test if there's 3 criteria that we need midwives or GPs or to think about, or the obstetricians. Does this person come from a high-risk ethnicity? And if you think about the maps that we've looked at, you in the audience, the people who know what those groups are, do they have low MCV, which is a red cell marker? And this is usually more relevant for thalassemia, but of course thalassemia combined with sickle cell can give the same clinical picture. Or is there a family history of hemoglobinopathy? And then what test do? We request a full blood count, the hemoglobinopathy screen, and iron studies. And then you get the report, or we do the testing, and then you guys get the report, or what do we do next? And we've put together this algorithm to try and make it straightforward. If something is found, you then go and test the partner. And there's a few extras that we've put in. So that's the first bit of testing. If thalassemia cannot be excluded, we would then recommend further testing in a few extra subgroups, which is sort of quite technical, but very useful for medical practitioners. And then the further action is if there's something in the mother, we go and test the father. And if there's something in both of them, we then, here we go, I've got this here. And then if both the mother and the father have a concern, we then need to test both of them. But I think at this point it's really important to point out that usually at this stage of screening, most women are deemed low risk and they don't need any more testing, and we can reassure them, and that is excellent. But if we're concerned there might be something on the beta globin gene in both the mother and the father, or the alpha globin gene in both the mother and the father, or we can't exclude that, that's when we need to do further testing, and they either get referred to someone like me or they get referred to the genetics team. And then depending on what the situation is, they might have more molecular testing, and that might be the beta gene or the alpha gene, depending on what the scenario is in front of us. But that's when we have identified a couple who are at higher risk. And that's really the purpose of screening, is to find these high risk couples, although usually we can reassure most people. So just so we have a couple and they're deemed to be high risk, or actually we know that they both have sickle cell trait, or one has sickle and one has beta thalassemia trait, what do we do? Well, the earlier that a couple are aware of their risk, the wider the range of treatment options. And this is sort of a really big take-home message. And so what are these options? Well, one option, if they're not pregnant yet, is something called pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. I'd arranged for someone to come and talk on this, but she can't come, so I'm going to run through that. And basically what this is, it's a process that involves IVF, and so you take the egg from the mother, you take sperm from the father, you combine it together in the laboratory, so that's IVF, and you make an embryo, and in the laboratory they can then do molecular, so genetic testing on some cells on the outside of that embryo to see what the genes are. And they can see, is this little embryo unaffected, does this little embryo have 2 copies of the sickle cell gene, or has it got 1 copy of the sickle cell gene? And then you can say, right, this one here is a carrier, or this one's unaffected. We'd like to have this one reimplanted, so the IVF process, to have the embryo implanted, we'll have those implanted. And so you choose not to implant those embryos that have got the sickle cell disease, so both the genes are affected. This has been around, the technology in Australia, for at least 20 years. It has been very expensive until recently, so it'll be about $10,000 just to get the molecular stuff set up, and then sort of $5,000 to $12,000 per cycle. So most of that is out of reach in terms of cost for an individual couple. 15 years ago, I actually wrote to the government and said, look, the cost of transfusing someone with thalassemia major is $100,000 a year. Like, it makes sense for the government to pay for this. But there has been advocacy. So I don't know if you're aware of Mackenzie's mission. So this was a family where they had a child who was born with an autosomal recessive disorder who died. And they had massive public support and massive public awareness. And they've started this trial through Mackenzie's mission, which is actually run at our hospital with our laboratory, looking for rare genetic disorders. And sickle cell is one of the ones that pops up there. And that's a program that's been a clinical trial, so it's a starting point. Can you screen couples, ideally pre-pregnancy, and then, or even during pregnancy, and then look to see what if the child's affected. And so that's, I've added that in about Mackenzie's mission because advocacy can make a difference and public awareness is really important. And the great news is the government now funds PGD. And so at the hospital I work, Royal Hospital for Women in Randwick, there's Rachel Rogers, who was hoping for her, I tried to arrange for her to speak today. She has set up a low-cost IVF unit. And she set it up not just to have low-cost IVF for anyone, she set up an oncofertility service, which is for my cancer patients, but she's also set it up for PGD. And so I've been able to refer patients so I know where the mother and the father are both carriers of beta thalassemia. And the out-of-pocket cost is about $2,000. So there's a little bit of a cost, but it's not really much at all compared to the cost of having a child and the long-term care of a child, and compared to what it would be in private IVF land. And she actually uses at the moment the scientists through Genea, who are the top 2 scientists who have set up IVF setups in Sydney. So there's definitely movement here, and I think this is really exciting, and I think the news has to get out to the community that these options are available, because the women and men need to know about this before they fall pregnant. What's the next option pre-pregnancy? Some people would say, look, we know we're at risk, we're going to have a natural conception, and then we're going to choose to do antenatal diagnosis of the offspring. So that means you do a chorionic villus sampling, which can occur at about 10 to 12 weeks, gestation, or amniocentesis, which is usually about 12 to 14 weeks. Slightly various methods, but basically they can pass a needle in, under ultrasound guidance, and they can get some cells from around the baby, and they then will test the cells. And once again, for this testing to happen, you have to know what the genetic changes are in the mother and father. And then with that detail, some patients would say, okay, this patient has sickle cell disease, I'm going to choose to terminate the pregnancy. And obviously this isn't the ideal option for everyone, and some people feel very strongly they'd always terminate, some people feel very strongly I wouldn't terminate, and that's one of the problems in this space, and why PGD is a better alternative, I think. So this is just a reminder of what you'd be looking at in those embryos or in the pregnancies. So they're the options if you're not pregnant, and then if you are pregnant, if you're not pregnant, you might say I want an egg or a sperm donor, or I might just have adoption, because then you have to worry about what to do if you might have an affected child. During pregnancy, the options are less. You can do the antenatal diagnosis, which is the CVS and the amniocentesis, or you can continue the pregnancy and screen at birth. So, where do we go to from here? So we've got a screening program throughout Australia that's widely done, and there's great access, and people are very familiar with this. I think it's really important for us to make sure the community is aware of what we do, and that it does happen. It's important for us to engage with the community and work out what expectations are, and education is really important. I think it's really important to improve molecular testing and PGD, and I've been giving this talk for 15 years now, and actually there has been improvement, so it's really exciting. This last 12 months I think has been a major step forward. And there's even, the MBS is now paying for alpha thalassemia testing, which is a huge step for laboratories, not so much the beta gene for sickle cell, but that's fantastic. There's new diagnostics. In the future, we might be able to do free fetal DNA, which is when you take a blood test from a pregnant mother and see what the DNA of the baby is. And we're doing that in other areas, and that potentially might be something which occurs during sickle cell disease. I think we need to have a database so that we can record all these results. Someone moves from one state to the next, we already know what their genetic makeup is. And we don't quite have a coordinated national screening program, and you can see it with the newborn and also with the antenatal situation. So just in summary, this is my last slide. Carriers of hemoglobinopathies such as sickle cell trait are common, and they fall into high risk ethnic groups, and so it does give us potential to try and target who we can do the screening for. We all know that having homozygosity, which is 2 genes in the affected child, can lead to severe health outcomes, and so screening is important. Antenatal screening is accessible. The earlier that a high-risk couple is identified, the greater the number of options available. And there's a role for all of us in the management of these men and women, as well as the children as they grow up. And so I think it's great that we can all be here and part of that process. I'll be interested in questions.
Excellent talk, and I have heard you speak about this for a while as well. We're almost there, guys. I was wondering, given time constraints, whether we can hold the question until the panel discussion, if that's okay. Don't forget your questions. I would like to invite our panelists. I suspect we have some here to be able to sit in the front, and some who are probably online. We've already met Dr. Giselle, so I'll ask her if she could. I think the program got changed.
It just doesn't make sense as much as it talks about genetic counselling.
Give us a minute while we confer. It's my pleasure now to introduce Dr. Zane Kaplan, who is a hematologist at Monash Health Centre, who's going to be talking about genetic counselling.
Well, it just makes a bit more sense to have it in with people working with you after the panel. But anyway, and I promise my talk will be relatively quick, I think, because most of what's been said already. So for those of you who don't know me, my name's Zane Kaplan. I'm one of the haematologists at Monash Health. Very fortunate to work with some other fantastic haematologists there, like Anthea, who keep me on my toes. And the other thing I also do is I oversee the molecular reference laboratory for the state of Victoria in both haemoglobinopathies and haemophilia. So molecular is one of the other things that I do. And for those that do know me, I'll apologise ahead of time. So I'm just going to cover very briefly the genetic counselling, and a lot of it's already been said. So what we'll cover is just the goals of genetic counselling, the process by which we go through, and what I thought might be useful is just to take you through the process that I go through with one of our genetic counsellors whenever we see the couple, rather than going through a whole lot of data. And then what we do with the outcomes of the consult, and then the options that we give the couple with regards to, as Giselle spoke about, during pregnancy or pre-pregnancy. So this is really a broad, overreaching statement that really does discuss about the principles of genetic counselling. And really what it does boil down to is a process by which gives people an understanding of the medical, the psychological, as well as the familial implications of a genetic condition that they carry in the family, to enable them to make a very informed decision as to what is the best for them as a group. And really what we do in this process is we integrate their family and medical histories. We assess the chance of the disease occurring within their family. A really fundamental role of what we do is education, because what we're aiming for here is autonomy of the couple, so they have to make the decision for themselves. We're not imparting our thoughts or our wishes on the couple, so the education really is fundamental to enable them to make a really educated decision about what they feel is the best for them as a couple. And then through that process we provide them counselling to make these informed decisions that can be used for the condition. And this is general for any genetic condition that we counsel for. And some of the fundamentals of why we should be doing this was first highlighted by the WHO in their report to the Secretariat, and this is 2006, but still holds very true today. And really what they put in this report was that the most cost-effective strategy for reducing the burden of haemoglobin disorders is to complement disease management with prevention programs, and that genetic counselling with the offer of prenatal diagnosis can lead to a large-scale reduction in births of affected children. And I think that's really what we do need to be at the forefront of really promoting for not just our patients, but for society as a general rule. So this has been alluded to already, and this is just to kind of show what can be done with a genetic condition. This is beta thalassemia in Cyprus, and what you can see with the triangular bars is what would be the expected rate of beta thalassemia major, and in the other line is what they actually found with really good genetic counselling. And again, this was mandated, not something we're thinking is a great thing for the way we think in Australia, but just to show what can happen with genetic counselling for conditions. And this is taken from the Greek experience, one of the few data that we do have on sickle cell. And again, you can see here in the subset of sickle cell populations in Greece, is that again with genetic counselling, you can significantly reduce the number of births from those that were expected with the condition. And this is probably the most important slide, I think, of really what we do in genetic counselling. And I think the three core principles that we really have to abide by, and the first two are the most important, is the autonomy of the individual and the couple. It's really them who's making the decision, not us. We're just providing them with the right and adequate information to complement their decision making. And really those are the two fundamental things that we need to think about when we're providing genetic counselling. And then obviously with everything that we do in medicine, we have to provide the highest standards of confidentiality. So with the goals of our genetic counselling process, we provide the couple with education about the disease. We explain to them the risks of having a child with the condition, and then we provide the couple with their reproductive choices and support the couple to make a decision that's right for them. And again, I just want to highlight that all of this is done in a non-judgmental, non-prescriptive approach, that really it is the couple that has to make the decision. So this is just the structure of the genetic counselling consult. So the first thing that we do is really information gathering. So we take a detailed family history, and because of a lot of, and this is true for any genetic condition, people of my Semitic background as well like to marry people from their own backgrounds, and that leads to a degree of consanguinity, and it's important for us to ask about that in these consults as well. For a lot of the conditions, there can be something like sickle cell disease where there is a lot of variability in, as Kylie presented earlier, with the phenotype of the disease. We do like to find out about other family members because that can help us predict to a degree what the couple is likely to expect, and also it enables them also to speak with family members and find out a bit of knowledge about their own family and the disease in their family. Then we review the results that Giselle already spoke about, and these are really fundamental for us because it does help us to form the basis of our risk assessment, particularly the DNA assessment. And the reason why this is the case, and this has already been alluded to today, is by strict definition, sickle cell anemia refers to people who are homozygous for the hemoglobin beta sickle mutation, whereas sickle cell disease refers to a whole other hodgepodge of other beta globin mutations that can result in a sickle cell disease phenotype. And the severity of these conditions varies markedly, as you've heard already. So beta plus together with a sickle is often a milder phenotype than a beta naught, though it doesn't always 100% hold true. And then there are a whole lot of other genes that also may be implicated, such as hemoglobin E, hemoglobin O Arab, hemoglobin C, as well as hemoglobin D. And it's really important for us to have a look at the actual genetic diagnosis when we're providing the family with advice on what the phenotype is likely to look at, and it really does help us formulate that discussion. Then the next thing is really education of the couple. The first thing we speak about is just the autosomal recessive inheritance and normal Mendelian inheritance that Giselle and others have already spoken about today. Then we spend quite a lot of time speaking with the family about the lived experience of sickle cell disease. We also give them the opportunity sometimes, if they want, to meet with another family who has a child with a similar condition so that they can get a first-hand lived experience as well. We discuss the symptoms, the severity of the disease, their management options, as has already been discussed, the social impacts. And then, whilst we do say currently it's an incurable disease outside of bone marrow transplant, we do touch on the fact of possible future treatments that may improve prognosis, but stress to the family that it's really important to think about what's available now rather than hoping for what's in the future when making their decision. And then once we've had those discussions, we then provide the couple with what their options are. And Giselle's already highlighted what these are. So preconception, you've got IVF with PGD, IVF with donor sperm or egg, and then they can conceive naturally with either testing during pregnancy or at birth, or some people decide not to have children of their own and go for adoption, as Giselle has already highlighted. And then again, the same prenatal testing that Giselle has spoken about. And then once we've provided the couple with all this information, we provide them with the opportunity to ask whatever questions they need, and then it's up to them to make the decision what they would like to do. And it's important that this continues in a non-directive, informed manner with overall respect for their personal values and beliefs. We try and make it as non-pressured as possible, but we all have time constraints, and if they're still having thoughts about it at the end of the consult, we offer them the opportunity for a follow-up appointment where they can come back and have further discussions with us if they need. And then after our initial consult with them, we'll then do whatever follow-up is required. If this is preconception, we'll organise for referrals to IVF specialists and a PGD referral if that's what the couple want. And if they were going for other, post this initial discussion, if things change down the track, we always give them the opportunity to come back. And when it's an antenatal visit, again, we organise for any of the tests that need to be done, do the consents, do the follow-up. Once we get the result, we'll get the couple back and have a chat to them about the result, or if they decide they'll continue on the pregnancy, we'll then organise for testing at birth and appropriate follow-up, usually with Anthea, and if they're unlucky, they'll draw the straw and get to see me post-birth to discuss their follow-up. And again, what we stress to the couple as well is that things might change with future pregnancies and to come back to us for discussions about future pregnancies. So like I promised, this was just a very short overview of what we do during the genetic counselling consult. And look, I didn't want to change too much the program, but I thought it just fit nicely with what we're going to discuss in the panel, that it made more sense to have this now. Slide remarks,
Thank you, Zane, for that, and I agree. It's really well. So thank you very much. We're almost there. I know that lunch is beckoning to us, but we do need to listen to our lovely panelists before we get there. So I'd like to invite back Giselle and Zane, who we've already met. Also like to introduce Dr. Anthea Greenway, who is a paediatric haematologist and the clinical lead in sickle cell disease from the Royal Children's in Melbourne. I believe online we have Dr. Kalumba, paediatric haematologist in Melbourne, and Felicity McNeill. I think from the Better Access program. I have also been Googling, so if I got that wrong, I apologise. And I think we'll be opening this up for discussion. Yes.
Can I ask a question?
Oh, absolutely. Wonderful. Oh, there's one.
Can you hear me? I just had a question about PGD. And do you have to meet certain criteria to qualify for PGD on the government funded or subsidised?
So I just had a brief look then. Because Rachel's been setting it up, I've just been sending her the patients. But I think you just need to have a mother and a father who are at risk of casting out a certain, like in a single cell, or just with a mother and a father. So the condition called hemophilia, which only the mother needs to be a carrier. So it just depends a little bit on the condition. And a lot of this has stemmed from that Mackenzie's mission. So it's trying to pick up those diseases that are rare, that are inherited. To do PGD, you have to know exactly what the molecular mutation is in your mother and father. So beta thalassemia, for example, there's lots of different mutations compared to sickle cell. It's one change in the DNA. So you have to be able to know what that is, because it all relies on that molecular DNA testing.
From a molecular perspective, the testing that we use in the context of beta thalassemia or sickle cell, we need a lot more DNA than you're able to get from, a 4 or 6 or 8 cell blastocyst. So what they actually need to do is use markers on the chromosome so they can identify definitively which is coming from which parent. And so you do need a bit more information, and often they will need 2 generations so that they can definitively identify which is mum and which is dad. So occasionally it does happen that a couple may not be able to have PGD because of those limitations, because we with the kind of DNA testing that we do, you need quite a bit more DNA than you do need to do the kind of assessments that they do for PGD.
I'm a clinical geneticist, so I could maybe just make a little comment on that as well, which is that with the Medicare, it does need to be a condition which is considered very to be severe, fertility and where there is no current widely accepted curative treatment. So there's also that criteria.
Questions? Anyone online?
I was just going to make a comment about, so we've talked about prenatal diagnosis and newborn screening. I think one thing for us all to just think about is how those things fit together. And as you can see, there's not a perfect model. The benefits of newborn screening, certainly relate to the fact that if we miss babies when they are born, they may well present with complications of the condition, and we fail to start antibiotics and many of the therapies we've talked about before. There's certainly a role for that. And I think it's trying to get the balance between, if we could be 100% sure we could test every single woman that may well become pregnant, and we would have a foolproof sort of system. In the absence of being able to do that, thinking about the complementary aspects of both systems is probably what we need to think about. So I think there is not really a one-size-fits-all, and trying to get those two sort of aligned is important, but the prenatal diagnosis is critical to be able to give parents and families choices about what happens for the family. Is that sort of pretty clear to the audience?
At risk of being controversial for the second time today. So I agree that newborn screening would be a great fallback, but I think it really should be viewed as our fallback rather than our first point of call. I'm pretty passionate to a degree about the fact that we use a broader sweeping brush than Giselle uses. We test all women for hemoglobinopathies in the context of pregnancy. And the reason why, in our healthcare network, different hospitals have different processes. And the reason why I think we're focused on sickle cell today, but best estimates are that about 7% of the Australian population carries a hemoglobin mutation. And I think given the rates of intermarriage that we have within our community, the fact that you can't really tell someone's ethnic background anymore by a surname, I think we've really kind of moved beyond those kind of simple screens as being whether we should be testing or not. And I think ideally we should really be testing every couple, because that's the time when they have choices. And I'm sure all of you that are parents in the room know what a stressful time a new baby is. And the last thing you want to be happening when you're a brand new parent is to hear that there may be a problem with your kid. And I think if we could identify those couples that were at risk prior to them even falling pregnant or while they were pregnant, it gives them the opportunity to make decisions and an autonomous decision, and also to prepare for what lies ahead. And really does give them that opportunity to really get their head around what the diagnosis may be and what that implication will be for their family, rather than say 3 or 6 or whatever weeks down the track when you're at home thinking that you've got the perfect baby, which you do anyway, to find out that there may be something that is wrong with the baby, because that's really the phone call every parent dreads. And so I think really if what we should really be pushing for is preconception testing, and then have newborn screening as a fallback for those that are missed in the initial pickup.
Thank you. I think we have someone. Perfect. Thank you. Is it a comment? Yeah. Did you have a comment that you wanted to press? Can you not hear us? Dr. Kalumba, would you like to say something?
Yeah. Thank you for this useful discussion. I just have 2 comments. The first one I want us to ask, because if we look at the NHS model, the advice, they got a target set for antenatal screening at 10 weeks plus 0, and to offer the prenatal diagnosis by 12 weeks plus 0, and to perform the prenatal diagnosis by 12 weeks plus 6. So that the target, they're probably around 7%, 8% of reaching the target. Do we know where we are? Do we have any target in our antenatal screening system? Where are we? How are we performing? Are we doing well? Where are we in terms of reaching the target? As the first comment. The second comment is about the screening, whether it's universal or selective. I mean, again, the NHS model, they categorize low incidence area versus a high incidence, where we have less than 1% of positive from the blood screen previously and more than 2%. Then they offer basically selective screening when the incidence is more than 2%. I think, and they also have a family of origin questionnaire where the families feel where they come from, because sensitivity of ethnicity and sometimes of a background, which can be a problem. And they follow that through. If someone is from high risk, so basically have a screening with hemoglobinopathy as well as part of the screening with full blood count. That's just a comment I wanted to make. I want to know where we are in terms of, are we reaching a target? Do we have any target in Australia for antenatal screening?
Yes, thank you. So the NHS has quite a comprehensive document and process, which they set up quite a couple of years ago. The NHS coordinates everywhere. So one of the problems with Australia, it actually comes down to individual health district. It's not even the state, it's the health district. And so we aren't as coordinated as the NHS. And I think places like America is even less coordinated. So it does depend a little bit where you live in the world. The NHS structures their screening program according to your risk. There's this family of origin questionnaire, which is trying to work out what your ethnicity is. And part of that is also by the borough, which is the health district that you would go to the GP in, and where you go to the GP is exactly where you live. And so it's quite sort of structured, organised over there, and they have got targets, and I don't think they meet the targets from what I've read, but hopefully they're meeting them now. What I read was a couple of years ago. So we don't have targets in Australia, and there's recommendations from the College of Obstetrics and Gynecologists that we should have screening, and what the screening should be, and that should happen. And you should screen the thyroid. There's a whole lot of things you screen when someone syphilis, HIV, all these things. When a woman comes and wants to conceive or is pregnant, the GP knows these are all the things that you do. But the question about the hemoglobinopathy screening does depend on the district, and so it sounds like where Zane is and other parts of Sydney, they do screen everyone. And part of that is because if you do the testing on every single woman, there's going to be a lot of negative results. But then when lots of negative results, when you do lots of tests, there's always risks of false positives and problems with the test. And so as a pathologist in the laboratory, you actually don't want everyone to have the test if they don't need it done, because then you get false results. So it is a little bit tricky, and that's why we try and work out how to target that. But I think as the population changes more and more, I think we'll end up moving more towards a universal model. I also think it's interesting the government in the latest MBS funding from the 1st of July is funding some of the alpha thalassemia testing, which is a big step forward and is a much more difficult part of screening than sickle. Sickle's very easy to pick up. And so I think there are little steps, and the last few years has been a few big steps, and we're not quite there yet. And the world keeps changing, Australia keeps changing, we'll have to keep changing with it, I think.
2 questions on the floor, so I'll start here and then I'll come to you.
Thank you for that. I just wanted to find out, is PGD always successful? Are there any chances that it might not be? Because I have read in some instances that of parents who have done screening, not with sickle cell disease, but then where the result was, they unfortunately ended up with a child who had the undesired condition, which was a genetic one, you see.
Yes, so I guess, I haven't looked at the stats on that lately. Rachel would have been able to answer that better. Look, there's always risks, and the system isn't fail-proof. And there are often the greater risk is that you fail to be able to do the molecular testing, and so you've made these embryos and you can't actually test them. That's actually the first. Well, actually, there's many areas when the PGD can fall down. First is you might not get enough embryos, so you might not get enough eggs from the woman, and then you might not fertilise them and make enough embryos, or at the end of the day you've collected 12 eggs, and 6 days later you've actually only got 2 or 3 to test. And so, and you're left with embryos that are affected, and you have to make a decision what to do with those. So actually it is a pretty difficult journey to travel, and it's not always perfect and fail-safe.
Okay. I think where I also wanted some clarification is that, is it possible that, and a successful embryo implantation goes through, the egg was actually tested, and in the end, a child is born and still has the undesired condition? I don't know if that's where I'm basically trying to look.
Things are always possible, and they always say like they're 99% sure, so I guess there's always a 1% chance there's going to be some failure. But I don't know the numbers on that, I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. And just...
We do offer CVS testing to some couples if they want it in the context of PGD for confirmation.
Okay.
So when the woman is now 10 or 12 weeks pregnant, then doing another test just to check. So you generally offer that.
So you're basically getting 2 tests, so PGD to screen
This is
for...
a very slight chance.
Yeah.
Particularly if you do
Cause
generally very, very low, like less than 1%. Generally offer screening.
So if you remember back to what I said right at the beginning, when I do genetic tests in the lab to diagnose sickle cell disease or beta thalassemia, whatever it is, we've got a large quantity of DNA that we can sequence that gene and know 100% that is the gene that we're sequencing, and that is the DNA makeup of that person. With the PGD, we're not sequencing that exact gene. We're looking for markers that mean that chromosome has come from mum and that chromosome has come from dad, and as a result of that we know it gets very technical, but it's not the same testing that we're doing in the lab when someone has sickle cell disease to make that diagnosis. So there is a theoretical possibility that you haven't identified the right chromosome mix. And so we do offer, we don't do the PGD, but the patients get sent back to us, and so we do speak to them about doing testing at 12 weeks to confirm that the pregnancy, but just to make sure.
Thanks very much for those very interesting talks to Zane, and Anthea's to come. I'm going to ask the same question a bit the other way around, and you can guess what I'm going to ask probably, and it's probably unfair of me to ask you, Giselle, but what's the risk to the embryo for the molecular testing for PGD, and then what's the outcome for IVF implantation from these procedures these days?
That's a good question. So there's always a risk. I mean, the way how Rachel would have had these pictures, there's a little embryo and there's little cells around the outside. They use these microscopes that they pluck off the cell, but I guess there's potential for damage, and they'll know because so if you're doing a fresh transfer, that embryo keeps growing. So they'll take the sample and it'll take them 24 hours to test it, and then they'll look at the embryo the next day. So if it's not growing as it should, they measure it very carefully. They'll have a few clues, and there's always a risk. But also IVF. So the rates for IVF for PGD are, people do IVF for lots of reasons. Often they do it because they can't fall pregnant, and so there's already a primary infertility, and so the rates of IVF success decrease the older you are. Generally the PGD patients are late 20s and early 30s. They haven't had a successful pregnancy to prove they can do it, but they haven't had infertility, and so their success rates are still higher. But there's still, in the general population there's a 30 to 50% miscarriage rate on any pregnancy, and so there's still that background rate that it's actually not going to work, you're going to have a miscarriage anyway. And so it's also important to be aware, you've gone through this huge several weeks, you've had testing, you've had all these blood tests and ultrasounds, and then you've had the eggs collected, and then you've worked out like you've got 10 eggs, and then you've got the fertilised, you've got less embryos, and then you have to have the one embryo transferred in, and you then have to wait a few more weeks to see if it's actually going to implant and have an ongoing pregnancy. So it is a long journey, and there can be problems and fall off all the way through. Is that sort of what you're asking?
Oh, yeah.
I just can't use
I was after a number.
I don't have the number.
The numbers when I
No, but it depends on the. It depends on the age of the woman. Depends on her ovarian reserve. It depends on how many embryos you make. There's lots of other factors. Yeah. So I can't answer that directly.
The IVF specialist who, we don't do that. The IVF specialist in their informed consent for the couple would have to be able to provide that kind of information, way beyond. We don't get paid enough to do that. We don't drive European convertible sports cars and have companies listed on the stock exchange.
Thank you, Hannah. I think we've got one more question on the floor.
Yeah. My question is, for a person who has like the sickle cell anemia already, is PGD an option for them? Like, let's say, like the female has the sickle cell anemia and her partner doesn't have anything. Is PGD an option to go fix that? Do you know what I mean?
I know what you mean. So if you try and picture that picture I had of the man and the woman, and you think about the genes, so just say the woman has got sickle cell, so both of her genes have got the sickle cell. So the woman has eggs. The eggs have only got half your DNA, so half the chromosome. So every single egg that she has will have sickle cell. So then you have to test the partner and see what he is. And it's really important in that situation to make sure that he hasn't got either. So if he's got 2 normal genes and she's got 2 sickle genes, every single child will have one from her which will be a sickle and one from him which will be normal, so they'll all be carriers.
Oh, so you can't go and use that PGD?
No, because all of her embryos will all have sickle cell in them. Yes, so you can't do that.
One other thing with PGD as well is there are strict ethical considerations around it. So for PGD, you could do it to exclude sickle cell disease, but if you said to the PGD IVF team, I don't want to have a child who is a sickle carrier, you cannot do that. So there are ethical considerations along with PGD as well. So you can only exclude the severe form of disease, but you cannot select out for carrier state for PGD. And I mean, you're a geneticist, so you'd know better than me, but for PGD it has to go through their own ethic. They've got their own ethics committees as well within those genetic services that provide that. And patients also get seen by the genetic counsellors within the IVF service. So we'll refer them to them, and then they'll have another meeting again with a genetic counsellor within the IVF service as well. And there are strict ethical and legal requirements about what you can and can't. It's all about, the fear of designer babies.
Thank you. One more question on the floor.
Doctor, just quickly on that note, with the ethical considerations that you said earlier, what about the ethical considerations around CVS testing once the results come back? What I mean is, what if the parents had to choose their options after, once they've received the result? So does your ethical, or does that organisation or ethical process take the CVS into consideration as well? So let's give you an example. Two couple find out that their child has sickle cell disease.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
it's not about the consequences, it's about the ethical considerations that you're talking about in the earlier tests.
So I think I'll give it a go.
Yeah.
Give a clinical geneticist to answer it, but look, with the ethical consideration, and it's not, I don't put my view onto the couple, and I won't disclose what my view is and on any of it, but it really is the couple's decision as to what they feel is the best thing for them and what they can do with their own ethics and with their own morals, and what they feel is best for them, not what I feel, within the realms of what is legal within Australia as to what time frame you can terminate a pregnancy up until, and it again depends on the hospital organisation. Beyond a certain gestation period, it needs to go to an ethics committee. whether a termination can take place, and then it's that ethics committee's decision if the couple wants it. But if we're assuming not in that scenario, where if it's at 12 weeks, 14 weeks, 16 weeks, that really is the couple's decision, like any other decision regarding their reproductive health is really the couple's decision. And my perspective, Anthea's, Giselle's, anybody else's, shouldn't really come into play, otherwise we'd be living in the United States.
I could just quickly comment. I think you did a really good job from a clinical genetics perspective. What we try and do in genetic counselling is called non-directive counselling, which means that we're not putting our own beliefs and our, like exactly you said, into the decision. It's providing options, and then it's for the couple to make that decision. And where ethics committees are involved is when there's a later decision, which means it's much more complex. But that's really the principle of genetic counselling, is non-directive.
So you mentioned that those are another pre-screening instead of symptoms. It was mentioned that they said that they don't want to pay this, they got knocked that application.
So, okay, maybe I'm understanding. So you were saying someone was going through a PGG process. So that would only be, so PGG under Medicare, but also under public, under private clinics in Australia, can only be considered for a severe or life-limiting condition. So you couldn't go to a PGD and say, I would like to have a girl next because I've had 3 boys. That's not, being female is not considered a severe life-limiting condition. So it wouldn't,
From my perspective, how's that different to saying do you want to terminate the baby? Do you know what I mean? Like, where's the equality?
Under a different ethical
It is, but where's the equality between this and
I know what you're saying. It's like why is it
one's
okay to
proactive,
terminate
one's
pregnancy,
reactive?
For personally, it's been very difficult for a long time that the public health service would pay for CVS and would pay for that process, but not for PGD. So it's a huge step forward, I think, for equity and for ethical considerations that there now is some government funding, and I think that's a really wonderful outcome for advocacy.
Thank you so much for all those questions, but I was wondering if we might want to talk about the newborn screening process, even though we've talked a lot about antenatal and PGD, and open up a question to Felicity, if she's able to. We've had a fantastic talk from Monica just before about the newborn screening process and the screening test, and I just wondered, from your opinion, how far do you think it might be before we start getting hemoglobin disorders onto the screening program, and what we might have to do?
Yes, so it's a little bit hard to hear you, but thank you for the time. It is a fairly radical commitment that Minister Butler and the Prime Minister have given with respect to newborn screening. It is actually intended to be a genuinely national program, like the National Immunisation Program, where it's funded federally and delivered at the state level. I think for those who are participating in this conference, sickle cell is one of the diseases that is on the list that Labor put forward as being part of the expansion. I appreciate the conversation that people were talking about as to what type of diseases it's going to be, what's included in the 80. What's really important is that the new government has basically set aside this long, convoluted process that was taking, I've never seen it take 6 months. It's averaging about 3 to 5 years. I'm a former bureaucrat in the federal government system, and newborn screening was a very slow process. You're going through MSAC, which is looking at cost effectiveness. Screening by its nature often isn't cost effective, it's the right thing to do. I hear what some of the doctors have talked about today with preconception testing, genetic screening throughout the life of opportunities and choices. And I'm fully supportive of that as well too. The problem you've got is that 2/3 of people carrying a rare disease don't know it, and how do we move into that space? I've been working very closely with the federal department about how they're going to implement this as quickly as possible. Minister Butler's spoken about it twice in Parliament. He wants it introduced quickly and expanded quickly. And I think it will be a lot easier. One of the things that they are looking towards is taking away this huge burden on patient groups and advocates to actually have to put the information in. looking at models when we discussed it with the government, the way the MBS task force did things, which is where the department got all the information globally, put a group of people together, such as doctors, ethicists, patients, and carers, to look at what evidence was there and necessary to move things forward. I think also some of the things that were mentioned, which is about, do we look to the NHS in the future of genomic testing and what that might offer for us? Australia is a little way behind, and we're a little way behind on newborn screening as well at the moment too, because we keep waiting for the perfect model, whereas we just have to get in and get things started if the evidence is there. And one of the commitments that the government made with this election commitment was to review what they're doing every 2 years. So to not be stagnant and wait for something to come forward because a pharmaceutical company's put it forward or a particular doctor's group has put it forward. It's to be proactive, and it's also to look at how it might sequence into the future with genomic sequencing while we move into blood spot screening. So for organisations, and I know that in Australia for Sickle Cell, this is something that has had an application made, I think it was 18 months ago, and it's been held in abeyance while things were changing. I think the opportunity to consult with the federal department to push this forward and how we actually expand newborn screening very quickly, and then have a process of continuous reform rather than reactive reform. And I think that's what I'd be encouraging groups and patients and carers who are participating today, domestically and globally, to really push Australia to do, because it's about trying to fix that. We have targets in Australia for immunisation that we never had 20 years ago, because it used to be a state-based program and we were having different levels of immunisation in each state and territory. Today we have national targets, and we have fantastic rates of immunisation, particularly in our children, because we set those things. Those are good things that we learn from the NHS, and we learn from the individual expertise of our state and federal hospitals who run individual programs. But we've also got to stop, as your panellists have spoken about today. It shouldn't matter where I'm born in my own country as to what my child is going to be screened for, what access to preconception I have. So if we're going to have universal health in Australia, it actually has to be universal, not postcode based. Hope that helps.
Thank you very much, Felicity. Very well said. Were there any last questions or comments? I suspect we're all getting ready for lunch. Kalumba, did you want to say something? I'm sorry, I can't see behind me, so I'm a bit lost. Dr. Kalumba, did you want to add anything to the discussion?
I just want to say, I think looking at the NHS model is could be very useful, so to learn from its antenatal diagnosis, screening, and as well as newborn screening, which we'll talk about. But I think we can learn a lot and try to make our system more efficient.
Thank you. If there are no more questions or comments, I might ask everyone to thank the panel, and we might break for lunch.
Yeah, I'm coming back. Here. All right, so we have lunch for 30 minutes, so we're at 12:15, so let's come back at 12:45, and we're going to have a breakout session. 2:45. Oh, thank you. I'm earlier on in the day. 2:45. So just we'll have some breakout sessions. So at 2:45 for the warriors and the caregivers, there's a room next door. That's where you'll be, and then everybody else, we can come to this men's session. All right. We'll have videos that will be running during lunch.